Ta-da! We have started the stream as per
Hello, everybody.
always. So, there we go. Now we're back on the air where we belong. It's a Friday. It's
Everybody.
4 o'clock on a Friday. Yeah.
It is the most foriest time of the day.
It is.
Oh, there we go. Now I can see us on mute over here, and oh yeah, we got a fun goat emoji going.
We got a goat. We got a cat. She's, as you can see, on her pillow throne where she reigns supreme.
Ripley is just chilling over my shoulder here. So yeah, we got
We got
the full
pets on
menagerie
thrones.
going.
Pets on
Yeah,
thrones. Much like how Ripley will suddenly start barking at nothing. Booker back here is going through a sneezing problem, so there is a good chance that she will go into a sneezing fit while sitting here, and it'll be very
That is
funny.
adorable.
Super funny.
I look forward to chuckling about that.
Yes.
Because that is always, cat sneezes are, I mean, all pet sneezes are pretty adorable, but I feel like cat sneezes are next level.
Like, she seems like she has allergies, goes through like a long while sneezing. So that's her life lately. I guess we need to start this sprint off.
We do need to start this sprint off. It's Friday. The weekend is almost here, but you know what that doesn't matter to? Writing people. It's always time to write for writing people.
Let's reset this timer.
Weekends mean nothing to us creative types, so let's get to it.
There we go. I've done it. The timer, she lives.
Excellent. Long-lived timer. Awesome. So welcome everybody to our third week of StorySights. We are your hosts, Tom and Nick, as you probably know already, unless this is your first time, in which case, hello. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really glad you found us. As usual, we'll be unpacking a couple questions this week. As always, this will be posted on the YouTube channel afterwards. So if you're here, you probably don't need to worry about that. But if you're not here and you can somehow magically hear me through space and time, you're good. As always, we will be running 15-minute writing sprints with 5-minute breaks throughout. So keep an eye on the bottom of the channel here for the sweet sprint timer, and we'll be yelling at you, encouraging things as we go. Please feel free to drop your word count into the chat. We love seeing how people are doing, and we'll give you all sorts of virtual high fives that mostly just look like us like trying to hit our cameras and stuff. Also, we always love hearing from you. So if you're in the chat and you're not writing and you just want to like say hi or let us know anything you're thinking about what we're talking about or any questions you have, please throw them in there. We're always happy to oblige. So Nick, what's our theme for this week?
Theme for this week, we have two themes, but are basically more or less part of the same theme. So one, I will let me fandangle it onto the screen here with the magic of technology. Is the premise. We were asked, there's a specific question we were asked about the premise, right? Which is how to get a cool premise.
That is correct. The big question was how not to squander your cool premise. So I think this is something that got a lot of traction in the chat last week, and it's something that I know a lot of writers worry about because there really is, particularly on Wattpad, where the idea of like launching your story kind of has cachet, and the idea of like really attracting readers that first time. A lot of our research has actually found that they'll come once you've completed your story, but I know as like a theater kid, I'll always think of it as opening night when I hit publish, and I know that's a really stressful time. So the question was around the idea of how to not waste a cool premise. And as I said, this is something we see a lot of, and I know a lot of people were excited to talk about. So that's the first one we're going to handle today. So what do we mean by a cool premise? It's always worth unpacking these things because I think we throw a lot of terms around pretty lightly because we all, particularly Nick and I, are talking about story all day, every day. So
work on this every day.
Yeah, so we just end up kind of like short forming a lot of stuff. Premise, just as a baseline for all of us, and I apologize because you probably already know this, but premise is just what your story's about. In improv, we have this term called the day of days, and that is, the scene we're seeing or the book we're reading isn't all the things that have happened in a character's life. It is the day of days, the most important specific time that we want to focus in on. So your premise kind of reflects that. It's literally, in a word, what your story's about. Now, the problem is often you'll come up with an awesome premise. I have this problem all the time where I tell my friends about it. I'm like, I had this great idea for a story, and I'll just like tell them what it is. And there's a danger, and particularly in certain genres, romance is a key example of this. There's a danger that your premise will be awesome, but that you won't necessarily be able to support that premise all the way through. Think of any book you've read the log line of, or the summary of, or seen a cool cover for, and you go, oh wow, like that's the story for me. I'm so excited about this. And then you get into it and you realize that the premise was all there was. As soon as you're through that cool premise, suddenly it's just every other version of that story you've ever seen, read, listened to. The example I always use is, because I'm old, when I would go to rent Nintendo games, like NES games, they'd have like these awesome covers that were like hand drawn and always looked like really, really awesome. And you get it home and it's like 8-bit blocks. No matter what game it was, it's always 8-bit blocks.
You just
and that's
shoot
totally
stuff.
fine. Exactly. You're going to run to the right of the screen and shoot at things, and you're going to jump. But the covers were there to help evoke kind of what this was going to be. So what we're going to talk about in the first half of our session today is how not to waste amazing premises. Case in point, your 2093 abandoned Scrivener files, 100%. It's the drawer draft of shame thing. It's the, I know, like, I've got a shame pile on my phone. It's just like I'll have a cool idea somewhere, and I'm like, this. And then 3 days later, I'll be like, there's nothing behind that. No. So, cool. This is a problem that we've identified. It's a problem we know people have. Here's the real question. What the hell can we do to fix it? Because as nice as it is to acknowledge that we've all had a similar experience, it's always nicer when we can actually solve the damn thing. So, yeah, there you go, Malin. You get it. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. So generally speaking, if you have an awesome premise, it means there is something in that premise that is different, unique, or exciting. Alessandro over in studios often calls this the edge. It's often in business called the special sauce. I tend to call it the point of difference, but it's just that little spark, that something that makes you go, oh, because, people argue that, there's only so many stories and blah, 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 blah. And to a large extent, that's true. But more importantly than all of that is there are things that make us sit up and lean forward a little bit in our seats if we're able to do so. Those things that perk us up, that hook our brains a little bit, that make us want to kind of think a little bit more about them. And that's really what a good premise is. It's whether it's, no matter how familiar the baseline is, whether it's person meets person, they fall in love, great evil threatens realm, hero must rise to defeat it, horrible monster stalking woods, plucky teenagers must defeat it, tiny 8-bit block person must run to right of screen and defeat it. There's something about all of those that is compelling, that's different, that's interesting, that just captures our imagination and our attention a bit more. The key to that, though, is to then consider what story you're trying to tell with that. There's a reason that a lot of these story ideas that we come up with that we then abandon fall apart, and it's because they're actually fairly flimsy. They're all flash and no substance. Like the NES boxes, they're a world we've imagined that seems really exciting, but then when you get down to it, it's like, oh, but at the end of the day, it is still just a guy with a gun running to the right of the screen and shooting at things. So the first thing to do when you have one of these ideas, before you even dive into it, is to determine what kind of story you're trying to tell. With romance, we see this happen a lot, where there's a really, really good premise, but once that premise is over, like once that sort of initial cool moment has happened or cool sequence has happened, it just falls into a cut and dry, this is just about people in a relationship story. And that can be very dangerous. That's often where we lose interest, because at that point we're like, okay, well, now I'm just reading the beats that I'm aware of. They'll get to know each other a bit. There will be some drama. They might break up, but they'll get back together. We're done and we're out. If you want a perfect example of this, cinematic rom-coms, particularly of like the late 90s, early 2000s, are a perfect case study for this, because a lot of the time they were using the same people in every single one. But they would have to find what that edge was that made each Meg Ryan rom-com feel different than the previous one. So first thing to do is just understand that. Look at your premise, look at that spark that got you excited, and consider what about it is actually exciting. The key here is whatever is exciting about that should impact, alter, and affect the story you're ultimately going to tell. If your cool hook is just an interesting thing that happens, but then we fall into the generic plot, that means it isn't actually enough to power the full story. A visual metaphor for this might be those old Wild West sets that were just like the front of a building just held up by sticks. That's usually what a cool premise is, if we can't find a way to link it to the rest of the story. It's just that cool facade that blows over in a stiff wind. So once you've determined what the actual spark is of that premise, think about the kind of story you're telling and see how you can weave that cool premise throughout the story. If at any point you're like, oh, well, I guess, so for instance, if it's, I don't know, let's say your premise is it's a firefighter romance. So, a guy is trapped in a building. He went back in to get his cat. His cat was allergic and sneezing a bunch. It's adorable. So we really care about this guy. He cares about his cat. And oh no, fiery beams just collapsed behind him. So he's trapped in his house with his cat. He's going to die because he tried to do something heroic. Boom. Big Boot comes in. Super handsome, sexy firefighter guy comes in, gets the cat, gets him, gets them out. That's theoretically an interesting premise. It's, it's a romance that's built in a high stakes, high danger scenario. There was a threat to their both of their lives. They've met with like an odd power dynamic. It's also, there's a huge kind of like heroic fantasy piece going on. That's a lot of stuff. That's really engaging. I'm sure all of you are playing a version of that in your head right now that you've probably seen or read somewhere before. The problem is, after that, they're just a couple guys dating and one of them has a cat.
Can't go anywhere from that point.
Exactly. We kind of used all the cool stuff right up front. Now, that isn't to say that this couldn't be a perfectly pleasant story, but generally speaking, a perfectly pleasant story is the kind of one that it's easy for us to tune out of. Think about those TV shows that you watch, and this is more true when we were all on cable, but they were just easy to kind of drift in and out of. You didn't really care if you missed next week. You didn't really care what was going on. You could put it on in the background, and honestly, if you fell asleep for 20 minutes and woke up, the circumstance would have changed, but not so much that you would really care. So instead, what we should be looking to do is figure out, okay, if I want to write this firefighter piece, what's going to carry it all the way through? It's unreasonable for the guy who is rescued to constantly be in burning buildings, unless there's a very specific reason for it. If he's an arsonist, that really changes things. If he's a wannabe vigilante superhero type with no powers who constantly gets himself in dangerous situations, that changes things. There are a variety of ways that opening premise around firefighters can be carried through, but if it doesn't, it just becomes a generic romance story. Where we often see this work very well on romance particularly is with sort of, generally speaking, it's sports, but kind of the celebrity dating piece, because there's so much inherent drama and material in the idea of dating your hero or a sports star or a celebrity that will just flavor the rest of the romance no matter what else is going on. And what's great about that is it gives you all sorts of external conflict that's woven into the romance, but also woven into high stakes drama. Fantastic. With our firefighter example, you have a civilian and someone whose job is to run into burning buildings. I guess we can get a little bit of drama from the firefighter going into other burning buildings, but again, there isn't really any reason for our lead character to be there, so it all just starts to fall apart. So, all this to say, when you get that interesting premise and you're super jazzed about it, figure out how you can weave it through, or if you can't, re-examine what's actually going on. Do you need to tell a different sort of story in order to make this premise work? Because often we tend to default to the genre we're most comfortable in or that we enjoy the most. In this case, of course, we're talking romance. But the story might not actually be a good fit for that. It might be a perfect story idea, but not for the genre you're trying to sort of cram it into. The two pieces have to work together. Otherwise, your premise is going to feel wasted. And ultimately, you'll get that horrible experience of readers reading the first bit going, I'm super into this, and then going, oh, that's not really about that, though, is it? That was just kind of the cool thing that happened, and I don't really need to stick around for this. Nick, what are your thoughts on this?
It's certainly true that like premise can't. People do like to use premise as like a flashbang at the start. Drop it in. That was really exciting. Oh my goodness, and then it fades into the background. I think, or it just doesn't have legs. It's certainly a classic one of really cool premises that we have that just can't go any further than that particular moment. You're gonna have to ask yourself. If the question here is like, how do I not waste my premise? The first question you're gonna have to ask yourself, obviously, you said, is like, where does it go? After, if you execute it, you may have to ask like, and then what? Or like, so what? Okay, sure. They meet, firefighter rescues them from a burning building, and then what? And if your answer is, I don't know, or I guess they'd keep dating, it's like, well, then you've lost the premise is gone after that point. My favorite one forever will always be Prison Break, because he needs to get him out of the prison, and I'm like, and then what? Like, what do they do after they get out of the prison? They're out of the prison. That's a great example of just asking like, but then what? The other one for me that's always really something that I find breaks a lot of people's premises is that they don't attach them to a character. They exist alone. For me, all premise all story has to be attached to a character. It has to be somebody's premise, basically, or somebody's story. Because you can make a premise in the abstract of saying, okay, it's a future world. There's superheroes are everywhere. Everyone can get a superpower, right, for free. But in order to do it, you just have to pass a particular licensing test, something like that. And so there's all these like licensed superheroes running around. You don't know what power you'll get at the time you sign up for your license. Like, isn't that a cool premise? And it's kind of like, not really. It's not a premise for a story because there's no story to that. That's just a concept, not actually a story premise. You have to have a character who now enters into this world and has some sort of relationship with that person's going to have to come in and say like, okay, and now we enter in, usually the classic one is a character who, this is why very commonly you'll have people do like, in a world where everyone can gain a superpower, they don't have one, right? So now they have a relationship with this premise. Often the ones that I see are wasted or run out of steam tend to be because they forgot to attach a character to it. It's so cool, it sounds really great. And so one is, as your point, so what after the premise resolves, like what then? And the other one is like, for whom? Like, who is this premise important to and who's going to interact with this premise is the other one for me that's kind of like where I see a lot of them start to fall off the cliff. And then the third one I'll leave on a cliffhanger because the sprint has ended. And so we celebrate 15 minutes going by. If anyone was writing and wants to post their word count, as I set a 5-minute timer.
Congratulations. You can take a break. You can think about other cool premises. If you're like me, midway through a story, when you start hitting walls, you just start thinking about other stories you would like to tell. That's totally fine. But yeah, congratulations. You did it. If you're watching this later and you're sprinting, good work in the future.
Yeah. And this is the 5 minutes for those who are with us, who have been busy. If you want to throw in your 2 cents on the side here in the chat about where you've felt premises stalling out, or if you, agree, disagree with what we're saying so far. Because I'd be fine with someone coming in and getting into a debate, telling us their other opinions. This is as much an art as it is an education.
And with the lag, you can kind of like come in and be like, how about this? And then just peace out and we won't even know. We'll have no way of tracking.
You got 5-second window.
That's right. You got a sweet 5 seconds to just like Indiana Jones slide under the door and out.
Correct.
Yeah. Maintaining tension. And I mean, you can also think about tension in this case as the premise itself, right? It's about maintaining whatever that idea was all the way through, rather than just having like a cool big flashy thing and then just kind of falling into whatever else it ends up being. Nick's example of Prison Break is a solid one, because it's like, okay, like Prison Break theoretically would have been an amazing 1-season show.
Totally great.
We're in this
one
prison.
Season.
We got to get out of this prison. The whole thing's going to be about, and specifically because the characters in that show are so geared to that specific scenario. My brother is in jail. He shouldn't be. I have the jail tattooed on my body, and that's how I'm going to get him out. Amazing. That guy isn't necessarily the best guy to break out of every single prison. He's supposed to break out of that prison. So then making him, oh, well, you're just the guy who's good at prisons now, kind of rough. So yes, it's about figuring out like, how can we weave it all the way through? The inverse of that, and I'm so sorry for invoking this, is Escape Plan with Sylvester Stallone, which has cranked out several direct-to-DVD sequels that are utter trash. But the whole premise for that is he designs prisons, and he's supposed to test whether unbreak-outable prisons can be broken out of. So that guy, you can legitimately put in as many prisons as you want, in as many movies as you want, and it makes perfect sense, because the premise is he is the best guy in the world at breaking out of prison. So every season or every movie, we can dump him in a new prison, and it stands. It's not, he is specifically good at breaking out of this one prison, and now we'll just put him in other ones.
He'll just need some sort of like character stake for why he keeps breaking out. Otherwise, you're just watching someone do their job, which is this is kind of what I've said with Superman too. I'm like, there are no Superman stories where he just generically saves the world. He always has some sort of larger stake or personal relationship. All the Spider-Man villains are like someone he knows in his life or is threatening someone he knows in his life. Because if you just watch them, like, it's okay to have a scene where they just help someone with a random robbery, but like that can't be no one wants to watch someone just do their job. And a huge thank you to Ren as well. I don't know how familiar you are, Tom, with Death Note. Death Note is probably perfect example of this at all levels. And so, I can get into it, and I'm going to say now to anyone who doesn't want to be spoiled, mute for a little bit, maybe something like that. Because I will go into like some of the spoilers on it, but Death Note's a great example of premise and the so what having answers, right? The so what and the who both having answers. Death Note on its own of saying, okay, the god of death is real, right? There is a reaper out there. There are many of them in this particular one. Doesn't matter. There are death gods, and they have notebooks, and they write in the notebook your name, and then you die. And so one of them, out of boredom, brings said notebook into the real world and just drops it for the humans to find because he wants to be entertained. He's like, I don't know what will happen. I'm curious what will happen. And so this premise of like, what if there was a book you could write in and kill anyone immediately is a really fascinating premise. But you then have to say like, okay, well, what happens after you kill someone? And at least with Death Note, it has that immediate like, all right, you're killing people, so you could get caught. So you have to not get caught while you kill people. If it could do it in such a way where it just magicked people to death and no one could figure out that it was you, it would not be very interesting. So it comes with a bunch of rules and stuff that require you have to not get caught. And then the who really matters because who the Death Note goes to in that case is specifically a person who is ridiculously smart and egocentric and immediately picks it up and thinks, I could use this to make the world a better place. Whereas if it was just picked up by someone who's like, I don't really care to kill anyone, so like, I don't know, I guess I'll do this one death, and has no stakes involved, then there's not a lot going on there. They just like randomly picked up this book, and the concept is still cool, but this particular character is interesting because they take on this premise of like, they have a relationship with the book, their dad is the chief of police, so they specifically are, or is a detective, it's been a while. So they specifically are like, my dad is trying to output justice, and I would like to basically make that happen as well. I'd like to achieve that dream. There we go. We can start the sprint again. Another sprint begins. So that's how they there you go.
Death Notes.
So that's how those are like. There's a premise in there that has a character attached to it who has a story to tell. The story is like he wants to make a new world using this book. The book actually no longer. The premise basically takes a back seat now to can this guy not get caught? Can he make his new world? And it becomes a back and forth. And then that premise runs out at the time when in that cat and mouse game between him and another character is immediately introduced who's trying to catch him. And they're in a permanent Sherlock and Moriarty kind of duel of wits who will catch the other one, which culminates in one of them catching the other one. It inevitably has to. Problem for Death Note is it keeps going, right? Like the premise, and this is why Death Note's a great one to transition into our second theme of like, how do you not break the book at that point, right? Like it's a good premise. It had legs. It worked for a while. And then it had to stop. Like he did one of them. I suppose I'm dancing around the spoilers. One of them catches the other one. And that should be the end of things. And yet it somehow isn't. It keeps going from that point. And so that's where you feel like that maintaining tension thing is gone because you already you're like, but he already did it. Like he already outsmarted them. Similar notes whenever any story introduces anything where they suddenly, this is why I hate any story that involves like time travel. As soon as you introduce that, you're like, well, now they can just go back in time and fix it, right? Or they can there's so many doors it opens, or as soon as they're like, oh, which one's really dumb for this? The third Harry Potter movie or book where they introduce the time turner. And it's just like, yeah, but now they can just go back to when Voldemort was born and kill him or something. Like, that would be the easy, you've got it. So, like, just go back and do it. It unravels a lot of stuff, which is why it never comes up again in any other story. It just vanishes. That's those kind of things where it's like, okay, the premise is now, it can't be a premise that can like not rise in tension because it self-resolves. It's just like, once you can travel through time, you can do anything you need. Or once you have like a ridiculous superpower, like you can just do whatever you want. No big deal. You have to be really careful with those kind of things with your premise. And these are all things that head into our, how to not break it. But if you have any parting thoughts on premise.
Yeah. Just to Avery's earlier question about maintaining tension, I think the ultimate, if you want to give yourself a test for this, it's if you run out of steam midway through a story, ask yourself, okay, is it because I'm not actually connected to my premise anymore? And it might not be, but that's often a pretty good one, which is I had a cool idea, and I've been building out of that idea. That was the seed from which this story has been growing, and now it's something else. It's gone. So doesn't mean the story needs to be scrapped. It just means you have to re-examine how it all links together and whether this is the right story for that premise. Also, best test when you get to the end is, by the end of your story, can you look back and be like, this all logically flows? This is a tree that has grown from that seed? Or are we somewhere so completely far off of that premise that either that premise needs to go, or I need to look at reintegrating it? To Nick's point about Death Note, there's a very clear point at which that should stop. If it's totally fine to go on, but you've got a big job ahead of you. It's any series that loses its lead. Scrubs is, I think, perhaps the most heinous example of this, where it's like, okay, well, JD is leaving Scrubs. We're going to do one more season arbitrarily with a different lead. Huzzah? Like it's like, okay, but now you have to reestablish everything, and you're basically just giving us a different show, and why bother? Just wrap it up and start a new show. You want to start Scrubs 2? Totally go ahead. So just look for kind of where the threads, all the various threads from your premise end up. Do they run all the way through? And at the end of your story, you're like, yeah, absolutely. This ties back into that thing I started with. Honestly, the later Family Guy is very guilty of this. Later era Simpsons is guilty of this, where they'll open with a premise and then weirdly just abandon it in like one thing from that premise will trigger a completely different plot. And it's like, oh, okay, well then why aren't we just watching that? Like that's the actual plot. Yep. Also, in terms of time travel, coming in on defensive time travel, most good time travel stories find a way to limit it. And ultimately, and we'll talk about this in Breaking, but with superheroes or time travel, all you really need to do is impose some limits. The Harry Potter limit was you can't have this anymore. It's kind of driving you nuts, so we're taking it away from you.
That's not a limit.
It's a limit in that the characters no longer have it. It's not a limit in terms of like why you don't go back and kill.
But it still exists. Like someone could be using it.
Well, and honestly, the most heinous example was the original Star Trek, because back then they didn't realize they were going to have to run for decades. So there's literally an episode that opens with Kirk just being like, "Captain's log, we are back in the 1960s." Yeah. And it's just like completely like they throw out a quick technobabble thing where they're like, Mr. Scott realized by reversing the polarity on the warp core, we'd be able to do this. And it was just so that they could shoot on the Paramount set without paying for a set, which is very funny. And it's a dumb episode. It's not like the good time travel that comes later. It's just a bad episode of Star Trek. But what's wild is those writers accidentally introduced an idea to their world that breaks it, and then just never talked about it again.
Those are classic. We can have the. I will pause and have this fight. But I am specific though, which is that non-time travel stories. So if it's not like Looper or
sure.
What was the really
time
famous
travel stories
one?
Exist in their own like
yeah.
side.
What was the really ridiculous one that was an indie film? That was about they just built a box and they all just kept going in it and creating duplicates of themselves and timelines of themselves.
I don't know that one. I would always jump to Butterfly Effect with Ashton Kutcher. I actually just made a time travel tabletop RPG, so check out Echoes of Chaos if you want to play this yourself. But yes, it opens up a big box of problems, and that's exactly what Nick was alluding to earlier. Let's transition into our second piece. We're exactly at halftime.
Thank you, Primer. There we go. I knew someone.
Primer, there we go. Yeah.
Primer has that, right? Like it's built to be a time travel vehicle from the beginning, so all it cares about is like establishing the rules, making sure they're right, getting it down pat. It's good. Whereas stories that just like halfway through are like, oh, by the way, now we can time travel, or like for this one episode of Star Trek, now we can time travel. Yep. Always breaks it every time because it's always like, wait, but if that's existed, you could just go back and solve all the other problems, or like now you can solve all the future problems. It always messes up everything.
Which brings us to the weird midpoint on breaking your story and premise.
Breaking your story.
Also, make sure that your premise doesn't accidentally break your story. And in this case, it's again, if you tell us, and this is often more with sci-fi and fantasy, I would argue more than almost anywhere else. But if you tell me that anyone can time travel, anyone has superpowers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then there are problems later that could be solved by that and are not, we as the reader start going like, well, hang on a minute, though.
Just do the thing.
And this is one of the biggest challenges to superhero writers of all time. I know as a kid, I didn't like Superman. I didn't like Rogue. Like I didn't like any character who was invincible. I'm like, it's too easy. If you just can't get hurt, it's too easy. Yes. Now, the interesting piece that I was missing on both of those characters is you have to give them something pretty, like there has to be a pretty big albatross around their neck to counteract that amount of power. Superman, initially, like on surface level, is the kryptonite piece. But on deeper reflection, it's that he ultimately just wants to do good and he wants to be a normal person.
Yes.
He would love that. He puts on, Clark Kent every day to try and be a normal person. There's a beautiful story that opens with this sequence. Unfortunately, the rest of the comic doesn't hold up. The opening's beautiful. And it's him just like failing to get on a train. And it's him like running, and he just does all the like classic kind of like Poindexter acting from like cartoons, where like he trips coming up the stairs and like his papers go everywhere, and he loses his glasses, and he's trying to find them, and then he manages to get to the train just in time for like his shirt to get caught in the train, and like rips his tie as it drives away, and everyone on the train laughs at him. And his monologue is just like, I do this every 2 days so that I can feel human. And I love that I'm bringing some joy to the people who didn't just screw up their morning's lives. And it's just nice to have limits. And then he just immediately flies to work. Right?
And then he just flies to work. Sure.
Done. But it's just a beautiful way of adding a burden to a character who is theoretically invincible. And I mean, ultimately with Superman, that usually boils down to Superman can't save everyone. So that's going to be the problem. Like he has
that's
infinite power.
Basically all of his... Almost every plot he has is about like you got to save only some of them. They have
exactly, and dealing with that as a highly moralistic character. With Rogue, it's that you're the most powerful X-Men person in the world, but you can never touch anyone or you'll kill them, and you have to live with the burden that you're using stolen powers and you're an awful person.
Right.
And then of course he works on a redemption arc. Blah blah blah.
Midas touch kind of thing.
Yeah. So all this to say, make sure when you're coming up with your cool premise, if you've got this cool premise, that you're not accidentally shooting yourself in the foot. Because that cool premise could completely screw you for the rest of your story. We've got Ren. You brought up a great comment in the chat here about characters dying in a world where necromancy is possible.
Yeah.
As someone who runs a bunch of Dungeons and Dragons podcasts, I literally just had to remove hell from my game because the characters got to a point where they're like, oh, well, like we know the Queen of Hell now, so if you die, we'll just go get you. And I'm like, I hate that.
We'll just come back. Yeah.
It just makes it too easy. It completely reduces the stakes. It just completely takes us out of
This is the classic Final Fantasy problem where they would try to kill a character in the story, but it's like, but I have a spell called Revive. I have an item. I have a Phoenix Down. We could just bring them back. What? The game mechanics don't work.
Hashtag never forget. We all know who we're talking about.
Yeah.
And I mean, don't give me that live stream garbage. Like, come on. Break my heart as a teenager and today. But in any case, so cool. First step to not breaking your story, make sure your premise doesn't break your story. There's a reason that in the Avengers series, they only start to mess with time travel in the final movie of that whole arc, because if that had come any earlier, that would have just been the question constantly. They also imposed limits on what that could do and what it took in order to facilitate it, blah, 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 blah. So be careful on that front. In terms of when you're in your story, we were talking last week about like sticking the ending. Like once you've got this great premise, and let's say you are maintaining it, you're on your way and everything's feeling great. To Avery's earlier point, you're maintaining tension. The promise of that story is running, and you're going like, yes, this is going great. I'm super jazzed. I know my readers are going to love this. You enter a whole new world of pain, which is, oh no, I have to stick the landing. Because we have all, at some point in our lives, experienced that story. From the sounds of things, it's Death Note for a couple of you, where you're like, this is amazing, I'm having a great time, and then it just completely crashes and burns. And there is a real specific disappointment as a reader, viewer, listener, player to that. Because endings are vitally important. Now, I'd also argue the journey is important. We talked a little bit about twists before. The twist shouldn't be the whole story. The story should not suck if you found out about the twist, because the craft around it, the story being told around that twist, should also be compelling. So there is always a way where the journey will be compelling in the ending. Even though it's bad, you still had a great time, so you can forgive it. Fine. As a writer, though, you want to avoid that as much as humanly possible. If you create the Game of Thrones TV show that is running for multiple seasons and everyone is lauding as the greatest television event of all time, you do not want what happened to them to happen to you. And in their case, it's because they legitimately just don't understand their own craft and kind of didn't care, which is a big, big, big red flag that happily doesn't apply to any of you because you're here thinking about your craft. So you're already better than the showrunners.
Well, that's always an important thing with this writing. And as we're doing like a sprint version of it, the great part about writing, even if you're posting as you go on Wattpad, is that it's your schedule. You don't have to produce it next week. You can go back and edit it if you realize you goofed it. If you write yourself, whenever anyone comes to me with these kind of corners they've written themselves into. Oh no, how do I? Okay, I said that they can't travel across the world, but I really need them to travel across the world now. What do I do? I kind of have to tell them like it's like when you're knitting and you just like miss a single stitch somewhere, and then you keep going and you recognize like, oh shoot, I'm off. My weave is off. You just have to unravel all the way back to that point usually, and then be like, okay, now I can fix it. Or the questions I would always ask is, I'm like, no one, as the writer, no one is forcing you to go into that corner though. You can just make them, maybe they don't need to travel anymore. That is kind of usually I find people break stuff at the moment where they're trying to force something that's against the rules they've already established, as you just said. They're trying to do something where they say like, okay, but I need them to be here because I'm trying to get to a scene that I've already thought of existing, and I want that scene to happen. It's super cool, and I want it to go. I feel like that's what a lot of people are talking about when they say their characters speak to them, the story speaks to them. Really what that's saying is like, well, I thought we would end up across the world in that fight scene, but that wasn't possible. And also, given that it wasn't possible, like, I don't know, that maybe isn't why my character should be doing things. And suddenly I looked at them a little deeper and went back and talked about it. That's usually, in my experience, what people are talking about. It's not always, although I'm sure some people in chat can disagree, it's not always as specific as like the character straight up saying to you, don't do this, like we need to go this way. It's more you started to realize like, oh yeah, right, they would never do that. That's not and therefore I can't have the ending that I had originally intended. It does need to change now in response. And I wanted to also touch on your point for breaking stuff. Usually where I find people break is they fail or stop trying to deliver on that original promise. Whatever they set up at the start and said, like, I promise you that this is going to be a spy thriller. I promise you that this is going to be a romance. And by the end, it's always a question. It's usually a fairly straightforward one. Like, will they get together? Yes or no? This is why I'm like, don't worry about spoiling the ending, because everyone already knows there's only so many possible outcomes for the ending. You just have to make sure that you deliver on said promise. And there we go. The promise of ending the sprint, though, did come true. It's been 15 minutes.
Oh,
I segued right into that. So well.
I love when promises come true.
Look at that.
So take a break, grab some water, grab some coffee, grab some tea, grab whatever beverage will just make your day a little bit better. Take a break from looking at your screen. Maybe keep your ears open, though, so we can yell at you for when it comes back.
Come tell us in chat about your chat. About your
let us know. So, yeah, Nick, I couldn't agree more. Honestly, my biggest advice about how not to break your story, other than obvious things like if your premise is slightly faulty or if there's like a structural issue that you've made, those aren't really breaking your story so much as just an issue in your story. What breaks the story, I find, is not delivering on that promise. Now, it's vital, and I know I've said this a couple times before, I'm going to say it probably every single time. There's a distinct difference between what your reader wants and what they need. So not delivering on the promise doesn't mean that you have to give the reader exactly what they want, because usually that's actually pretty dissatisfying. There's a reason, like we want our characters to succeed and be happy and do well, and like I think we want to see them strive. But if they just get everything they want, that we're falling back on that Superman issue of just like a character who is super nice, always correct, invincible, and does the right thing all the time is super boring. We just don't care.
Yeah. It's a huge factor of the comments, right? Like you read the comments and it feels like from the readers, because they're always cheering the characters on. They want them to kiss. They want them to get together. They want them to win the fight. It's very rare for someone to just be like, oh, we'll cover that, Ren. Sorry. It's very rare for someone to be like, I hope they lose this fight. Like, you'd have to make it so that they really hate your character. But in almost all cases, they're cheering it on. And so you feel like, as the writer, like, oh, is that what they want? They want to see that? And it's like, not necessarily. They're just cheering. But
I mean, we see this a lot with people who are attracted. I mean, it's the Kylo Ren effect. Like, they're attracted to the villain or the bad boy and just want to see a redemption arc. And often these characters shouldn't be redeemed. They should face kind of the consequences of their actions in a fairly dramatic way. But the readers are identifying something they like. And I mean, I've talked to writers who are like, no, I set this person up as an irredeemable scumbag. And I've got people in the second book being like, but like, what if he had like a nice side? Yeah. It's like, no, that's just not his function. Ren, you've asked a great question. I do apologize. We should have got to this before we got too deep into it.
Promises.
The idea is there's this mental framework called commitment consistency, which is basically that, like, kind of once we've said, it's what a lot of sales is based around. But once we've kind of said yes to an idea of a thing, we're kind of locked in. And I would argue that the promise of the story is it's linked to your premise. It's certainly linked to the blurb, the log line, but more importantly, there's no one specific place where you do this, but it's essentially when you're saying to a reader, this is the experience I'm giving you. This is for you. It's up to you then, as a writer, to kind of make good on that. If we talked about this a bit with capital R romance, but if you're telling a capital R romance, it should, and I mean, I hate this, but I've been outvoted at Wattpad and I guess in the world, it needs to have a happy ending. That's the promise of, or a happy for now type of ending. So if I, as a reader, am sitting down to read a capital R romance, I can do so with the assumption that the promise you're making to me is, no matter what happens, we're going to get a happy ending or happy for now. Like there will be, I'm not going to get suddenly like, and we talked about this with Forces of Nature, like suddenly like completely taken aback out of nowhere with like, oh, and then he just spontaneously combusts at the end and she's left alone and dies alone. And we're like, wait, what?
It would be very confusing, certainly.
Yeah. So the idea is that you're selling us as a reader on an idea. And if we are agreeing to continue to read, we've bought into whatever you've sold us as a general kind of promise to us, the reader, that this is the journey you're going to take us on. That doesn't mean that it has to be predictable. It can still be twisty. It can still subvert our expectations. Mm-hmm. All of that is still on the board. For instance, using Game of Thrones as an example, Game of Thrones has a lot of very abrupt character deaths. It's famous and I'd argue notorious for it at this point. But that happens in the first book. And the first book is like, here's, without any spoilers, here's your lead. Here's the person that traditionally leads all fantasy stories of this type. And then by the end of the first book, they're dead. And basically, that's the promise that George R.R. Martin is making to you as a reader. I'm going to give you a fantasy story that hits a lot of the same beats and tropes that you're used to and excited about, but it's going to be unpredictable. And if you don't want that, you should stop reading these books because it's only going to get worse from here. And as a reader, I can then make the educated decision. If I get to the end of that book and I'm like, screw this, I want my heroes heroic and my villains villainous, and I just want it to run that way. The promise that's been made to me is that. So if I stick around, like...
Yep, I can start the sprint again.
Oh boy, sprinting recommences. Much sprint, very sprint. Malin, you've made a great point here. This isn't to say that you can't then mess with them, because the funny thing is, part of this promise is that there's the suspension of disbelief piece, but also the like, I'm agreeing to let you take me on the roller coaster, mm-hmm. right? It's one of the reasons that horror is so effective, because horror, one of the kind of promises we're making is that we're okay with not really knowing how this is going to work out. In a lot of cases, particularly sort of the slashers of the 90s, you can count pretty hard on like the final girl trope carrying through, but that could be subverted, and it is in several films at any time, because the promise that we've made, or like the agreement we've made, the commitment we've made is, I'm here to scare you and ratchet up tension and keep you on the edge of your seat. And I'm going to do everything in my power to do that. Your job is to sit back and kind of let me do that and go on the ride with me. If you're constantly sitting there being like, no, I hate this, this is stupid, you're not on the ride with me. So nothing I do is really going to change that for you, because you're actively deciding not to engage. If you're watching a fantasy or reading a fantasy story and you're like, dragons are stupid, I can't believe they're here, then it doesn't really matter what I do with my dragon story, because you haven't agreed to come on the ride with me. And in terms of the happy ending piece and the romance piece, I'm saying you can have them break up. You can have the ex show up and they're pregnant, and oh no, there's a secret marriage, and oh no, one of them is dying. And I'm sitting here just having like a horrible time with it, but I know that ultimately you're going to bring me home safe, right? Like you're going to like bring me into the landing. Now, I say this as someone who thinks about content all the time, and I can tell you, and I'm sure you can tell me from a lot of your readers don't necessarily know this is what they're doing. And a lot of the time, they will just hate you for this roller coaster, and or just decide, no, I don't trust this person. I think they're here to screw me. And that happens a lot, where readers will just like either nope out or just get furious at you for doing something. Like for me, it's always with comic books. It's a common trope in comic books for characters to die and then come back. And sometimes it takes an awfully long time, but like it'll happen. At some point, a writer is going to go, I really wish I had this character. Screw it. XYZ thing happened. Now they're back. But readers go bananas just every time it happens. This has been happening now. Like you have readers who've been reading for like 3 decades, losing their minds when their favorite hero dies. as though that hero will never come back. It's bananas to me, but it's because people care and they get wrapped up in it, and they aren't necessarily looking at it from that critical lens of like, I'm far enough away from this to realize that, yeah, this is just good storytelling. And it also speaks to, again, the trust factor. Do I trust that the writer is going to bring it home for me? When I love Murder, She Wrote. I think I may have mentioned this before, but like, I unabashedly love Murder, She Wrote. I know Jessica Fletcher is going to solve this crime, because she literally always solves the crime. Mm-hmm. And who knows, maybe they get away, but she's going to solve it. I'm never going to leave going like, it's never going to be like a Zodiac situation where I'm like, but who was the killer? It's going to be like, it was him, the guest star of the week. He's the killer. And there's a comfort to that. So when I tune in for that show, that's really what I'm after. So all that to say, no matter what genre you're writing in, you are making promises to your readers. And to not break it, the question is to just kind of go back and re-examine what that promise is. Yep. And is what you're doing still answering that? If it isn't, that's okay. To Nick's point, you can go back and actually rework what that promise is. That's totally fine. You might have some angry readers if you're posting live. But if you're midway through the story and you're like, no, you know what, there's a better version of this, feel free to go back and change it.
Go back and change.
But what doesn't work is if you're like, hey, we're getting pizza tonight, let's order a pizza. And we order a pizza, and then you're like, surprise, it's lobster. I'm like, but wait.
That is a good one, that there's a promise. A promise made, promise delivered.
We agreed to this, and then now it's something else. And like, I might like lobster, but like, I'm not here for it. Or I could be deathly allergic, or just think it's like a scary, Cthulhu monster, and I don't want it anywhere near my face. Like, there's lots of options. But that's an unpleasant experience for an audience. Again, we talked about this, I think, pretty recently too. Like, Romeo and Juliet actually does this. And it's why it's a very common teaching example. I use it as a teachable example. But it's a hard one because in the Shakespearean sense of comedy, which is people will fall in love, they'll face some adversity, ultimately they will get married, the end, the sort of traditional like Western theater definition of comedy. It's a comedy, and then suddenly everybody dies out of nowhere. It's the original M. Night Shyamalan twist. And that's why it's so hard to categorize. We all call it a tragedy, but structurally and narratively, it's a comedy until it isn't. And I can only imagine what being an audience member at that time must have been like, because it would have been a complete out of left field twist that would have blown a lot of minds, but also likely made a lot of people really angry. Because again, if I'm showing up to watch these two teenagers like make admittedly terrible decisions and then fall in love, like, cool, that's what I'm here for. Then suddenly it's like, no, reflect on your ways. Big shock. So all that to say, when you're worried about breaking your story, what you're likely actually worried about is that you're not going to deliver on this experience you're trying to create. So think about that experience. What are you trying to create for your readers? Are you trying to create that tragedy that will haunt them? There's basically, and this is more about endings, but I think it relates here. There's 3 major endings, and there are 1,000 variations on each of these. But the 3 endings are a happy ending where the plot is resolved and the characters get what they deserve, whether that's good or bad. A sad ending where the story is resolved, the characters don't get what they want, or get what they want but realize that, they've really sacrificed too much to get it, and what they wanted isn't actually what they needed.
They're still sad at it either way.
Exactly. It basically, one ends on an upbeat, everything worked out the way it should. One ends on a downbeat, everything worked out contrary to what we wanted. And the ambiguous ending, which is meant to either the story is wrapped up or it isn't. Generally speaking, if you're going to end a book, there's some form of
very hard to pull those off.
But like something has to be done. The plot has to be done. But what it means is left ambiguous. This is more common in film, I would argue, than literature. But the best example being a film like Inception, where the final shot of the film leaves it up to us to interpret what we think actually happened. And the idea with the ambiguous ending is that's the one we should all go away and argue about. It's the one where you want your readers to be arguing in the comments about what they think it means. It's usually when they start screaming at you for a sequel. So those are really the only 3. And it's up to you which of those is the most satisfying end of the experience you're creating for your reader. And then when you're doing this examination of whether or not you're breaking your story, to take a good, honest look at like, okay, well, what is the experience I'm trying to create, and what should be at the end of that experience? And again, when I say like happy and sad are pretty loaded terms, it doesn't mean that everything has to work out. Breaking Bad has a happy ending despite a tremendous amount of tragedy. A bunch of these sort of anti-hero shows lean that way. It's just figuring out, again, like landing it appropriately for your reader. Not necessarily giving them everything they want, but giving them what they need, giving them that experience that you wanted for them. The other thing is, they may disagree, and that's okay. There are a number of, just think about any time a favorite character has been killed off in literally anything, and people are like, oh, like I just hate it after they killed that character because that was my favorite character and I don't care. A lot of the time as a writer, you're like, yeah, but you wouldn't have, like, I was out of material. Like, the character's purpose was served, their arc was complete, I had nothing else for them, so here we are.
Yeah. Same with when series ends. In general, people feel that way when like a big series ends, and it's just like, yeah, but it had to end. It doesn't always need to keep going in that sense.
For sure. And as a writer, it's your story, and this is something I cannot stress nearly enough. And admittedly, with all the advice we will ever give you on Wattpad, this is also true. You can just not do it because it is your story, and we can advise you based on our experience and what we know and what we think will work and what our experience has told us will work. But at the end of the day, we're not the writers, you are. So that may mean you miss out on opportunities or what have you, but at the end of the day, it's your story. That also counts with audience. Your readers might be mad. They might say you ruined the story, what are you doing, and so on and so forth. That's their right as someone who's been enjoying it, but it's also up to you to determine, okay, does that mean I actually have to change what I did? Or is it one that's like, well, actually, no, this is how I think this should go, and I'm willing to take the heat because this is how this story runs. All
started sneezing back here. Yeah, and there's a difference between breaking a story as a reason for upsetting people and just upsetting people with how you chose to do the story. I think, an important part with the roller coaster that we talk about when we discuss, like, oh, we're taking readers on a roller coaster ride. When you get to a roller coaster, it ends where it starts. You see how it's going to end. You can see the whole roller coaster in front of you in most cases, but you at least know it's always going to come back to this spot. And so, you go into it knowing it's going to be a ride, but then it works out in the end. I think I simplify the promise down into, for another part of Ren's question, like, yes, the promise should shine through in the blurb of your story. It should shine through in the first chapter. It should be immediately clear what the promise is. It should never be the kind of thing that is built up to, that people just don't know what's going on. I simplified the promise down to a yes or no question, and that's it. And I'm just saying, like, okay, for any given romance, the yes or no question is, will they end up together? Yes or no. That's about it, really. And you're just delivering on that promise. And in the case of a romance, the answer will always be yes, basically. And the other part for me is simplify it down to this yes, no question. And as you put, yes, no, and then question mark, I guess, on any of those ones. But you're just asking a question, right? For Game of Thrones, you're just asking, like, will a character ascend to the throne, basically? Will they figure out their stuff before the White Walkers arrive? Is really the only question there. The one that he used with the Sixth Sense. Can he or can't he see ghosts? That's the only question being asked. And the twists usually come not from providing the wrong answer, right? Like, you thought he could, but he couldn't, or you thought it was going to be this, but they don't. Often twists come from them giving you the answer you still thought you'd get, but in a way that surprised you or that you didn't think was happening along the way, that you're just like, oh, that did technically answer the question, though, of, like, can he see ghosts? He can, but I found it out in a way. I got the answer in a much different way than I thought. I thought I would just like establish he can see ghosts because, like, I don't know, he punched one of them. Or in the horror case, the question is almost always like, will they survive? Or will they stop the killer? That's basically it. It's just the question, and it's yes or no. So that's the promise that you're offering. To your pizza lobster thing, you can't say, like, will they stop the killer? And then lobster shows up at the end. Or if at the end of it you say, like, and now they're together and they're a happy couple. I'm like, but you didn't. The question was whether or not the killer is stopped. I do not care that now they're together in a relationship.
Yeah, well, and I mean, to the pizza lobster example, you might then turn to me and be like, oh, I can't wait for the lobster to get here. And I'll be like, wait, lobster? And you're like, yeah, it's going to be delicious. I got all this butter. We're going to have so much lobster. Here's your bib. And I'll be like, well, I didn't want lobster. I want a pizza. And then a pizza arrives at the door. And I'm like, you got me. But but ultimately the pizza still arrived.
Or it's a pizza with lobster on it. And they're like, I didn't lie.
Like, oh, damn. Yeah.
I didn't lie.
Or you're like, it turns out you've been a ghost the whole time, Tom. And I'm like, what?
Yes.
That's why I can't eat the pizza lobster.
Yes. But that original question was always answered. You can't deviate from it. That's what frustrates people. Usually it's not like that they didn't. If you do a romance and you end it by not telling people whether or not they got together, they'll be frustrated. That's not a twist. That's not a satisfactory, like, no, but I inverted expectations. It's like, no, you didn't. You didn't answer your promise. That's all. You can invert the expectations, just make them not get together. Or make them get together, but at least make people question if they got together, but was the whole thing a dream? There, now it's an ambiguous ending. Or if they got together, but it was right before, like, maybe their car was about to crash, but they finally admitted their feelings. Did they survive the crash? We'll never know. But at least you delivered on the promise of, like, yes, they did get together. Yep. You can't subvert it by just, like, answering a different question altogether. That's a common one that comes up. Or I just find people just drift, and they want to just, in order to keep tension going, which you've alluded to, and I guess is a whole other thing for us to get into another day, you have to keep raising stakes, right? You have to make each thing, it's got to be bigger and badder. But sometimes in the process of raising those stakes, they deviate from answering the original. They have to raise them to a point where the original question no longer matters. And now it's like, yeah, but they're going to save the world. Like, but that's not what the original question was. The original question was like, could they stop the killer? Not could they save the world? So you have to be really careful where people raise these stakes. I see a lot of, this is why I'm like, write it as a summary and you'll be able to see it really quickly all at once. Because I'll ask a lot of questions when people show me their summaries of just like, well, where in the first act was this promise? Like, nothing that came up in the first act shows up in the third. There's just usually in the third or second act, a new enemy gets introduced. And then they're like, and now you have to beat this guy. Always frustrating whenever that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think ultimately that's it. In terms of premise, what you're doing is you're setting up, just kind of wrap all this up together as we're just coming up on time here. With premise, you're setting up that promise and you're creating the conditions that I as a reader can determine whether or not I want to hang out and read it. And your premise is almost always going to be awesome. That's the other thing. Like, premise is really easy to come up with, and you're going to have 1,000 of them. To Avery's earlier point about the 2,000 abandoned stories.
We've always got more premises.
This is going to be a lifelong struggle for every single writer. The question is it a premise that has legs? Can it carry us through? Is it something that actually can be woven through the rest of the story? Or is it something really awesome that we're all going to get really excited about and then almost immediately falls over? And then we're like, oh no, we're just in a regular story. Once you've found that grounding, or if you came in strong and it's already all built, making sure when you're looking at whether or not you're going to stick the landing or break it, what experience am I trying to create for my readers? What's the promise that I made to them? What experience did they sign up for? And how can I bring that to a conclusion? In a conclusion, again, as we said, may make them angry. It may be because you did your job, as Avery pointed out a couple comments ago. You made a breakup on the way to the happy ever after. Might be because you violated genre expectations in a way that's either extraordinarily good or extraordinarily bad. Either way. If you're looking to stick the landing, make sure that if you are violating genre expectations, that you're doing it in a way that still fits within the genre constraints. To Nick's point, they get together, but then the car crashes. Okay, well, I still got my happy ending because they were...
Answered the question.
Yeah, we answered the question of whether or not they'll fall in love. They did.
Somewhat ambiguously.
If they will live forever in that love.
Yeah.
And also just be prepared for the fact that a lot of the smart decisions you as a writer will make will upset your readers. Saw Ren's comment here about shipping characters who are never meant to end up together. Absolutely. There's all sorts of stuff like that. As the nice thing about Wattpad is, because you are getting comments in real time often as you're writing, you can decide whether or not you want to incorporate those. But I would strongly encourage you to apply all of this will this break my story thinking to every one of those decisions individually. Oh, you know what? They really want these two people to get together. Okay, well, I could maybe make that work. But it's not a question of if I could, it's a question of if I should. Yep. And once you get to that point on our flowchart of like, yes, no, it's like, okay, well, I could. Should I? I'm not sure. Well, what's the promise of the original story?
Promise people
the story
that?
Is it's we're going to stop the serial killer who's killing everyone. Okay, well, then the hero probably shouldn't date the serial killer no matter how charming they are, because that's gross.
Right.
Which is part of the reason why Silence of the Lambs is so smart. because she's not trying to stop Hannibal Lecter. She's trying to stop someone else. He just happens to be there. So you can get around things in a weird, interesting way there. Although, yes. Also, screw that whole romance angle in Hannibal.
It's weird.
Forever.
It's all weird.
Anyway, all this to say, make sure your premise is woven throughout. Make sure that it actually has enough to give your entire story that burst of excitement and edge that that premise has. And if you're worried about sticking the landing, just go back and think about what that was. Think about the kind of experience you're trying to create, and make sure to the best of your abilities that that's what you're delivering on. Yeah. And that's our time.
We covered it. This is where I like to be meta too. Right at the start of this, I set up a promise of a sneezing cat, and the question became, will the cat sneeze? Yes or no. And we went through the journey, and yes, the cat did sneeze. If people didn't catch it, they can rewind and they'll find it. And then you end up in this fabulous epilogue here, where the cat just puts on a show for everyone and languishes around. So I welcome you to the post of our story. The cat did. Oh yeah, there we go. Perfect. Just love it.
I mean, the real denouement would be if one of us had to leave to answer the door because a pizza just arrived, but we didn't think
that would be
far ahead.
The perfect. I should have ordered a pizza in advance, but that's on us for not figuring that out along the way. But there you go. So we wrapped it up.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you for the wonderful conversation, for bringing your own examples. Again, it's always so much more fun and useful, I think, to have an actual conversation than for us to just kind of jaw on for an hour about whatever. If you were writing either now or in the future, I hope you got some great stuff down or got some great thinking done. But once again, and I really cannot stress this enough, just by taking the time to think about stories today and to think about your stories today, you've been working. This is writing time that you've committed. So whether or not you put a single word to the page, thank you for joining us and for making the time to write and to think about writing and to think about your craft. We are off next week because it's a holiday here in Canada. So Nick and I are probably going to be playing video games instead of talking about stories.
Oh, I will. I can guarantee you I will.
I believe we'll be thinking about stories.
There's a very specific game I know I'll be playing because it'll have just come out. So
is it Evil Genius 2?
It is.
Excellent. So we'll be there. We'll probably both be Evil Geniusing it up. Once again, thank you for joining us. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time. If you do have more questions, please continue to submit them. We keep finding stuff in these podcasts. It's video,
live
streams, whatever. In us talking. So we're always going to try and cover whatever came up in the previous chat. If there's something big, this came up. How not to break your story came up last week. So we want to make sure that we're capturing those as well. So we might do more of these kind of like, half and half episodes, but we'll see. Again, it's all very new. We'll also be upgrading our looks as we go along. So get ready for some fun. But otherwise, have a wonderful weekend wherever you are. Stay safe. Happy writing. And we will see you possibly with a sneezing cat again.
We'll see.